Meghan is over. That's what Canadian taxpayers are saying tonight. And this time it isn't gossip, it's a number. $539,000. That's how much Canada spent protecting Meghan Markle, and the government is now being forced to explain exactly where that money went. I'm Edmund Hale, and before this video ends, I'm going to show you three numbers. The first one you'll hear in about 30 seconds. The second one is the one that's actually gone viral, a single weekend that cost more than most people make in a year. And the third one, the one almost nobody is talking about yet, is the one that connects this story directly to a court case still sitting open in the UK right now. Stay until the end, because that third number is the one that changes how this whole story reads. $539,000. That's the total cost of the private security protection provided to Meghan Markle and Prince Harry on Canadian soil, according to figures obtained through financial reporting on the couple's time in British Columbia. To put that in perspective, that's more than most Canadian families will earn in a decade. It's public money, money that came from the same taxpayers who fund hospitals, schools, and emergency services, and it was spent protecting two people who at the time held no official government role in Canada whatsoever. But here's what makes this story different from every other royal spending headline you've seen before. It's not the total, it's the breakdown. Because once you see how that money was actually spent, week by week, this stops being a story about security. It becomes a story about a promise that didn't hold up. In a single year, the year Harry and Meghan were dating, before their engagement was even announced, security costs alone reached $365,000, not spread across their entire stay in the country. 1 year? And then there's the number everyone's repeating right now, $10,586 spent on protection for a single weekend. Meghan spent with a group of friends, a girls' weekend, paid for in part by the Canadian public. I'll get to exactly how that weekend happened in a few minutes, because the timing of it is almost unbelievable. But first you need to understand why Canada was paying for any of this in the first place, because that's the part of the story that makes everything after it so much worse. Here's what most people don't realize. When Harry and Meghan relocated to Vancouver Island in late 2019, they were still technically working members of the royal family. That status is what triggered Canadian security involvement in the first place, a courtesy extended to visiting royals, coordinated between British authorities and Canadian law enforcement. This kind of arrangement isn't unusual on paper. Visiting members of foreign royal families and heads of state routinely receive coordinated security support from host countries. It's a diplomatic norm, not a scandal by itself. If Harry and Meghan had spent 2 or 3 weeks in Canada on an official visit, nobody would be talking about this today. But that isn't what happened. What started as a short retreat turned into months of residence. There was no fixed end date attached to the arrangement. No public agreement spelling out exactly when the funding would stop or exactly what it would and wouldn't cover once the nature of their stay changed from visiting to living there. That ambiguity is precisely where this story turns from an awkward footnote into a real controversy. Because in January 2020, everything changed. Harry and Meghan announced they were stepping back from royal duties. They wanted financial independence. They wanted to build their own brand on their own terms, funded by their own income. That was the promise. That was the message delivered to the world in carefully worded statements, released without warning to the palace itself. And yet, according to the reporting now circulating, the security bill in Canada kept running. The couple had declared independence from the institution, but not, it seems, from the country-footing part of their protection detail. Keep that contradiction in mind, because it's about to get a lot more specific. Let's walk through exactly how this unfolded, because the timing is what turns this from a simple expense report into a genuine credibility problem. And once you see these dates side by side, you'll understand exactly why this story refuses to die down. November 2019, Harry and Meghan arrive in British Columbia with baby Archie, taking an extended break described publicly as a return to a more private life, away from the pressures of royal duty and UK press attention. Security coordination between Canadian and British authorities begins almost immediately, treated as standard practice for a working royal and her family. December 2019 into January 2020. This is the window where costs spike hardest. The couple is dividing time between the island retreat and Vancouver itself, attending private engagements, meeting friends, moving between properties. Each movement requires a security footprint, vehicles, personnel, a coordination with local law enforcement. It adds up fast, and during this exact stretch is when a significant chunk of that $365,000 yearly figure was logged, January 8, 2020. The bombshell, Harry and Meghan announce, without prior coordination with the palace, that they intend to step back as senior royals. The statement talks about becoming financially independent. It talks about balancing time between the UK and North America. It's framed from the very first sentence as an act of self-sufficiency. Long January 2020. Buckingham Palace confirms the couple will lose their HRH styling and their public funding through the sovereign grant. Financial independence is now official policy, not just a phrase in a press release. The institution has, in effect, formally cut the cord. March 2020. Harry and Meghan formally relocate away from Canada, moving south to California. Canadian officials confirm that federal protection support is coming to an end. Read those dates again. The independence announcement lands in early January. The actual departure doesn't happen until March. That's roughly 2 months. 2 months where the couple was publicly telling the world they no longer needed royal-funded support, while Canadian security costs were still being absorbed by the public purse. And somewhere inside that exact 2-month gap is where the $10,586 weekend happened. Now let's talk about the detail that's generating the most attention, because it's the one that turns an abstract budget line into something people can actually picture. $10,586 for one weekend. A weekend Meghan reportedly spent socializing with friends, away from Harry, away from official business of any kind. This wasn't a diplomatic function. This wasn't a security requirement tied to a public appearance or an official engagement. According to the reporting, it was personal time, the kind of weekend any private citizen takes with friends, except this one came with a security detail funded, in part by a country's taxpayers, during the exact window when the "we don't need this anymore" statement had already been made public. Compare that number to what an average Canadian family spends on an entire month of groceries, or a semester of tuition, or a full year of daycare. $10,000. One weekend. That contrast is exactly why this detail has struck a nerve in a way that the larger, more abstract $539,000 figure hasn't fully managed to on its own. People can't picture $500,000. Everyone can picture a weekend away with friends, and that's usually how these stories actually spread. It isn't the biggest number that goes viral. It's the most relatable one, the one an ordinary person can hold in their head and compare directly to their own life. $10,000 for a weekend does exactly that. It's the number that turned this from a finance story into a comment section firestorm. Here's where the story gets more complicated and more damaging than a simple expense report. Harry and Meghan have spent years building a public narrative around privacy, lawsuits against tabloids, public statements about being hounded by paparazzi, an entire docuseries dedicated in part to the idea that the media invades their personal space without justification, and that all they've ever wanted is to be left alone to live a normal life. And yet, according to royal commentators now weighing in on this story, that same narrative sits uneasily next to a security bill funded by public money, money that exists precisely because the couple's location, movements, and personal weekends needed to be tracked and protected by government resources they hadn't fully separated themselves from. Critics aren't necessarily arguing the couple didn't need protection. High-profile individuals frequently do, and threats against royal family members, current and former, are a documented reality that shouldn't be dismissed. The argument being made is narrower and sharper. If you're asking the public to fund your protection, the public has a reasonable right to know how that money is spent. And a girl's weekend costing more than $10,000 is a difficult thing to defend as essential state business, no matter how real the underlying security concerns might be. There's a second layer to this too. Part of the reason Harry and Meghan say they left the UK in the first place was to escape constant scrutiny over their finances and their lifestyle. This story does the exact opposite of what they were hoping to avoid. It puts a hard documented number directly in front of the public, at a moment when trust in their "we just want privacy and independence" message is already fragile. Following the emergence of these figures, pressure has mounted on Canadian officials to clarify exactly how the arrangement was structured and why funding continued for as long as it did. Opposition politicians in Canada have used similar royal security stories in the past to question government transparency around discretionary spending. And this case is already being framed the same way, as a test of whether taxpayer money tied to high-profile individuals gets the same scrutiny as any other public expenditure. The core question officials are now facing isn't really about Harry and Meghan directly, it's about process. Who approved the continued funding after the January 2020 independence announcement? Was there a formal review at any point between that announcement and the couple's eventual departure in March? And why did it take investigative reporting rather than proactive disclosure to bring these numbers into public view in the first place, years after the fact? Those are uncomfortable questions for any government to answer. And they're exactly the kind of questions that tend to keep a story alive well past its first news cycle, because every follow-up answer or every failure to answer becomes its own headline. Type "accountable" in the comments if you think public figures should have to explain exactly how taxpayer-funded security money gets spent. No exceptions. If you want to keep seeing this kind of deep, fact-checked breakdown of what's really happening inside the royal family, not the surface-level gossip, but the documents, the timelines, and the numbers behind the headlines, subscribe now, because there's an open thread here I'm going to come back to before this video is over. What this Canadian bill has to do with Harry's own security case, still sitting unresolved in the UK courts, and why royal watchers say the two are more connected than they first appear. This isn't the first time questions about the Sussexes' finances and their relationship with public money have surfaced, and it almost certainly won't be the last. Since leaving royal life, Harry and Meghan have repeatedly framed themselves as financially self-sufficient, funding their lifestyle through media deals, brand partnerships, and their own commercial ventures rather than public funds. That's the entire foundation of the Sussex brand. Two people who walked away from an institution and built something of their own. That's precisely why this particular story lands as hard as it does. It isn't just about the money, it's about the gap between the story that's been told publicly and the details that are now surfacing about how their transition away from royal funding actually played out on the ground, in Canada, in real time, month by month. Royal commentators have pointed out that Harry's ongoing UK legal battle over his own private security arrangements, a case that has dragged through the courts for years over his right to publicly funded protection when visiting Britain, adds another layer to this story. Harry has argued through his legal team that he and his family face genuine, credible threats, and that reduced security puts them at real risk. The UK courts have weighed that argument carefully, and the case has gone through multiple rounds of review without a final resolution satisfying to Harry's side. Security funding, who provides it, and who's entitled to it, has become one of the most persistent flashpoints of Harry and Meghan's entire post-royal life. This Canadian figure isn't an isolated incident. It's simply the latest chapter in a much longer argument about where the line is between legitimate protection and public money being spent on a private, post-royal life, an argument that started the moment they left, and one that clearly hasn't been resolved on either side of the Atlantic. Here's a detail that makes this story even harder to explain away. Since relocating to California, Harry and Meghan have signed deals reportedly worth well over $100 million combined, streaming agreements, publishing deals, brand partnerships, and various commercial ventures carrying the Sussex name. So the obvious question is simple: if the entire point of financial independence was to fund their own lifestyle, including their own security, using their own commercial income, why was Canadian taxpayer money still covering costs for personal, non-official time, in the exact weeks they were telling the world they didn't need institutional support anymore? Nobody in the Sussex camp has offered a direct answer to that specific question, and in the absence of an answer, the public is left to draw its own conclusions, which, based on the reaction to this story so far, are not landing in Meghan and Harry's favor. To be fair to Meghan and Harry for a moment, royal security is never cheap for anyone who holds it. Protection costs for working members of the family, William, Kate, and their children, for example, run into the millions of pounds every year in the UK alone, covered by the British taxpayer as part of the standing arrangement for the direct line of succession. Nobody seriously disputes that a future king and his family need that level of protection. The difference critics are drawing here isn't security costs money. Everyone already knows that. The difference is who is paying for what and under what justification. William and Kate's protection is tied to active, ongoing constitutional roles, engagements, state visits, official duties performed on behalf of the country funding them. Harry and Meghan's Canadian costs, by contrast, were being generated during a period explicitly described by the couple themselves as private time, personal transition, and a deliberate step away from official duty. That's the distinction driving this story. Not the existence of a security bill. Every senior royal has one, but a security bill funded by a country the couple had no formal role in, covering personal social time. Right as they were telling the public they no longer wanted or needed that kind of institutional support. This also isn't happening in a vacuum. Over the past several months, Meghan has faced a string of stories that, taken individually, might seem minor, but taken together, start to look like a pattern royal watchers have been tracking closely. Questions have been raised about product and design choices on her lifestyle brand appearing strikingly similar to other independent creators' work. Her popularity numbers in recent public polling have consistently trailed those of other senior and former royals, even as her media ventures continue to expand. And now a documented dollar-for-dollar security bill that contradicts the independence narrative she and Harry have built their entire post-royal identity around. None of these stories on their own would be enough to define a public figure. But together, they're starting to shape how a large part of the public reads every new Sussex headline with more skepticism and less benefit of the doubt than they received even 2 or 3 years ago. This security story is landing inside that environment, which is exactly why it's spreading as fast as it is. Since the figures started circulating, reaction online has been swift and largely one-sided. Comment sections across major outlets covering the story have filled with the same core objection, phrased a dozen different ways. If you want to be treated as private citizens, don't let a government keep paying for your protection during your private time. Some commentary has been more sympathetic, pointing out that Meghan and Harry never personally approved or itemized their own protection detail. That decision typically sits with security agencies, not the individuals being protected. And neither Harry nor Meghan would have direct visibility into exactly how those costs were categorized or billed. That's a fair point, and it complicates the idea that Meghan herself is personally responsible for every line item in that $539,000 total. But fair or not, perception matters just as much as process in stories like this one. And right now, the perception being reinforced, headline after headline, is the same one that's followed Meghan since she left royal life. Someone who says she wants less attention and more independence, while remaining, in one way or another, financially connected to the very institutions and countries she says she's stepped away from. Officially, Buckingham Palace has stayed completely silent on this story, and that's almost certainly deliberate. Every time a Sussex controversy surfaces, the institution's default strategy has been the same for years now: say nothing, let the story run its course, and avoid giving it any additional oxygen by engaging with it directly. Royal communications teams have learned, often the hard way, that responding to Sussex-adjacent headlines tends to extend their lifespan rather than end it. According to royal commentators who track palace strategy closely, this is exactly the kind of story the institution is quietly relieved to see gain traction, because it does something the palace itself can never do without looking petty or vindictive. It shifts scrutiny onto Harry and Meghan's own claims of independence, using documented figures rather than institutional opinion. When the criticism comes from taxpayers and opposition politicians in another country, rather than from the palace or the UK press, it carries a different kind of weight. It's harder to dismiss as an orchestrated smear campaign, which is exactly how Harry and Meghan have characterized negative coverage in the past. That's part of why this story matters beyond the dollar figure itself. It's one of the first major controversies in this saga, where the source of the criticism isn't a UK tabloid and isn't a palace insider. It's a paper trail, coming out of a country that has no institutional stake in protecting or attacking the royal family one way or the other. That neutrality is exactly what makes it so difficult for the Sussex team to wave away. Now remember the third number I promised you at the very start of this video. Here it is. Harry's UK legal case over his own publicly funded security has at various points been estimated to carry legal costs running into the millions of pounds, fees tied to years of hearings, appeals and reviews, fought specifically to restore the level of taxpayer-funded protection he had before stepping back as a working royal. Put the two stories side by side, and the picture becomes uncomfortable in a completely new way. In the UK, Harry is fighting at significant legal expense to get British taxpayers to fund a security level he says his family needs to stay safe. At almost the exact same time, in Canada, taxpayers had already been funding exactly that kind of protection, including, according to the reporting, a weekend that had nothing to do with safety concerns tied to an active threat, and everything to do with a personal visit with friends. Royal commentators are now asking the obvious question: if the argument in the UK courtroom is that Harry's family requires publicly funded protection because of credible danger, how does that argument sit next to a documented Canadian bill that includes over $10,000 for a private social weekend? It doesn't disprove the danger Harry describes, but it does make the case for critics considerably harder to argue with a straight face, and that's exactly why this Canadian figure is being raised now inside discussions about the UK case by people who had never previously connected the two stories. Let's bring this all the way back to where we started, because there are three questions running through this entire story that nobody on either side of the Atlantic has directly answered yet. First, who approved continued Canadian security funding after the January 2020 independence announcement, and was there ever a formal review of that decision? Second, why did a personal, non-official weekend generate a security bill north of $10,000 when Harry and Meghan's own commercial income by that point was more than capable of covering private security themselves? Third, how does a security bill built on private, personal time in Canada square with a UK legal argument built on the necessity of continuous, credible threat-based protection? Until those three questions get real answers, this story isn't going away. It's going to keep resurfacing every single time Harry or Meghan talks about privacy, independence, or fairness in how they're covered. It's worth laying out the strongest version of the counter-argument too, because this story isn't as one-sided as some of the loudest reactions online might suggest. Security decisions for royal and former royal family members are almost never made by the individuals themselves. Threat assessments are conducted by trained security professionals working from intelligence the public never sees, and the level of protection assigned is based on that assessment, not on personal preference or convenience. If Canadian and British security services determine that a specific threat level justified continued protection through a particular weekend, that's a professional judgment call made independently of what Meghan or Harry wanted or asked for. There's also the question of precedent and safety. Reducing or removing protection abruptly, the moment a public statement about independence is made, could have created a genuine security gap during an already high-risk transition period. A newly public family, extensively covered by international media, moving between two countries with a young child. Security officials have to plan for worst-case scenarios, not headlines. Supporters of the couple also point out that neither Harry nor Meghan has ever claimed to be fully self-funding every aspect of their lives from day one of their transition. The stated goal was financial independence going forward, not an instant, overnight severing of every remaining tie to institutional support. The moment the January statement was released, a transition period, they argue, was always implied, even if it wasn't spelled out in detail for the public. Those are legitimate points, but they don't fully answer the sharpest version of the criticism: why a girls' weekend specifically cost more than $10,000 in public funds, and why that specific detail hasn't been addressed directly by anyone close to the couple. Threat assessments can explain an overall security posture. They don't on their own explain that one number, and until someone does, that number is the one carrying this entire story. There's a business dimension to this story that's easy to miss if you're only focused on the security figures themselves, and it might end up mattering more than the number itself in the long run. Meghan's entire commercial identity, since stepping back from royal life, has been built on a specific idea that she is a self-made, independent businesswoman, not someone coasting on royal privilege. Her media ventures, her lifestyle brand, her public messaging, all of it leans on the story of two people who walked away from an institution and built something entirely their own on their own terms, funded by their own work. Long story is valuable. It's arguably the single most important asset the Sussex brand has, because it's what separates Meghan and Harry's commercial ventures from simply trading on royal titles they no longer formally hold. Brand partners, streaming platforms, and publishers have all, at various points, leaned into that self-made narrative when signing deals with the couple. A documented public record showing continued reliance on a foreign government security budget, months after declaring full independence, chips directly at that asset. It doesn't necessarily break any partnership on its own, but it hands critics and increasingly cautious business partners a very specific, very citable example anytime the self-made independence narrative gets repeated in an interview or a press release going forward. In branding terms, that's the expensive part of this story, not the $539,000 itself, but what it cost the credibility of the story built on top of it. For now, no formal inquiry into the Canadian security spending has been confirmed, and neither Harry nor Meghan's representatives have issued a detailed public response to the specific breakdown of the $539,000 figure. That silence is notable in itself. In past controversies, the Sussex team has moved quickly to shape the narrative through statements, interviews, or their own media platforms. This time, the numbers are being left to speak largely on their own, which some royal watchers interpret as a sign there isn't an easy explanation to offer without raising even more questions. What's clear is that this story has given critics of the couple something they've wanted for years: not another op-ed, not another anonymous palace source, but an actual documented figure, a receipt. And in an environment where public trust in institutions is already fragile, a hard number tends to cut through in a way that vague criticism never quite manages to. Write $539,000 in the comments if this is the first time you're hearing the real breakdown of this story, because based on how quickly this figure is spreading, It likely won't be the last time it comes up in headlines about the Sussexes. Stories about royal spending tend to follow a predictable cycle. They spike for a few days, get picked apart in comment sections, and then fade once a newer headline takes over the news cycle. Most of them are forgotten within a week. This one is built differently, and that's worth spelling out clearly before we close. It isn't based on a single anonymous source or a claim that can be quietly denied and left to die. It's based on a specific traceable dollar figure, broken into specific traceable components, a yearly total, a girls' weekend line item, a timeline that can be checked against public statements the couple made themselves, on the record, in their own words. That combination is what makes a story durable instead of disposable. Vague criticism fades because there's nothing to point back to. A number doesn't fade the same way. Every time Meghan or Harry gives an interview about independence, about privacy, about being unfairly targeted by the press, this figure is now sitting there, available to be raised again. By journalists, by commentators, by anyone in the comments section. It's become a fixed reference point in a way that most royal controversies never managed to become. That's exactly why, if you've made it this far, this is a story worth actually following, rather than skimming past. The headline version everyone else is repeating only gives you the total. What you now understand is the full mechanism behind it, the timeline, the contradiction, the legal case sitting on the other side of the Atlantic, and the 3 questions nobody's answered yet. That's the version of this story that's going to matter 6 months from now, long after the initial headlines have faded. Strip away the headlines, and here's what this story actually comes down to. A family that left the royal institution specifically to control their own finances ended up, for a stretch of months, still relying on a foreign government security budget, including for personal time that had nothing to do with official duties, at the exact moment they were publicly declaring independence from that kind of support. That contradiction is the real story here, not the number itself, as large as it is, but the distance between what was promised publicly. Full independence, no more reliance on institutional support, a quiet new life, funded on their own terms, and what the documented spending actually shows happened in the weeks and months after that promise was made. Whether Canadian officials ever fully explain how this was approved, and whether Harry and Meghan's team ever directly addresses the figures, this is a story that's going to keep resurfacing every time the couple talks about privacy, independence, or being treated unfairly by the public eye. Once a number like $539,000 is out there, documented and traceable, it doesn't disappear. It becomes the standard critics measure every future claim against, and it's going to follow this story for a long time. I'm Edmund Hale. See you in the next episode of Behind the Crown.